A mysterious incident occurred in a forest near the border with Myanmar. At that time, Sergeant Luke was leading a team and took his troops into the forest for a patrol mission. When they reached a certain point in the forest, something happened that made their guide warn them to turn back. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. The entire incident occurred around 1984. At that time, Sergeant Luke was part of a military patrol team assigned to patrol the border area near Myanmar. He served as a squad leader, with the primary duty of patrolling and inspecting the forest in rotation with other teams, both during the day and at night. In that region, it was well known that the forest they patrolled had an area that was not just called a forest, but a jungle. This area was characterized by dense vegetation where sunlight could not penetrate, creating a gloomy atmosphere that seemed as if it was always about to rain. The soldiers were well aware of this, and no one dared to venture into that area unless absolutely necessary. One day, Sergeant Luke had to switch to the night shift. His team was scheduled to begin their patrol at 5 p.m., and the team comprised a total of 9 officers, with Sergeant Luke serving as the team leader. Coincidentally, that night they were required to venture into an area known as the jungle because they received reports that there would be a transport of illegal immigrants in that area. It was well known that no one wanted to enter that area, but they had to go anyway because they knew it was their duty. At that time, Sergeant Luke hired a hunter to guide them into the area. The hunter prepared 5 offerings for the forest spirits: a boiled chicken, liquor, incense, flowers, and soil wrapped in banana leaves. The soil was taken from the camp where Sergeant Luke was stationed. Initially, the atmosphere along the journey into the forest seemed normal. However, around 10 p.m., Sergeant Luke's group stopped to rest and took a head count. Sergeant Luke decided to talk to the hunter, suggesting that once they entered the jungle, they should change their formation from a single file to a line abreast. This was to ensure they could help each other quickly if danger arose. The hunter nodded in agreement, and everyone continued their journey. As they entered the area known as the jungle, the hunter instructed all the soldiers to line up, remove their hats, and clasp their hands in a prayer position while lighting 1 incense stick each. The hunter then performed a ritual to open the forest and asked everyone to place their incense sticks on the boiled chicken they had brought as an offering. However, something strange happened. None of the incense sticks could stay on the chicken. Every time they tried to place an incense stick on the chicken, it was flicked off, as if something was trying to warn them. Seeing this, and with his extensive experience in venturing into deep forests, the hunter immediately asked everyone to leave the area, explaining, "I have asked for permission, but it was not granted. We must leave. If you don't, you will have to proceed on your own because I will not go further." When the soldiers heard this, they were alarmed, but Sergeant Luke firmly told the hunter, "It is our duty. We must go in. If we don't proceed, we may neglect our responsibilities." Upon hearing Sergeant Luke's response, the hunter turned and walked back the way they had come, ignoring any further words. He believed he had already warned the soldiers sufficiently. The 9 soldiers then decided to continue their journey without the hunter. Before setting off, they lit their incense sticks again. This time, instead of addressing the forest spirits, they prayed to the divine powers for protection and a safe journey. By the time they finished the ritual, it was already 1 a.m. The soldiers began to move forward again, walking in a line abreast. After some distance, the soldier walking last, in the 9th position, suddenly became terrified and said, "Sergeant, I really can't take it anymore. Can I change positions?" Sergeant Luke immediately asked, "What's wrong? What did you see that scared you?" The soldier only replied, "I'll explain later, but I can't walk at the back anymore." This caused a bit of a problem since none of the other soldiers wanted to swap places with him. When asked why, they just mumbled and looked at each other, but no one would speak up. Seeing this, Sergeant Luke decided to switch places with that soldier so they could continue their journey. They continued to advance through the dark forest, pressing deeper into the jungle. After a while, 2 soldiers asked to attend to personal matters. Shortly after, one of them came running back with a terrified look on his face and reported to Sergeant Luke, "Sergeant, something's wrong with my friend. He suddenly collapsed." Upon hearing this, everyone hurried to check on the fallen soldier. When they arrived, they tried to revive him. After a short while, the soldier regained consciousness, but his condition seemed unusual. He appeared dazed and kept muttering, "I saw a snake, a huge snake.
I'm scared.
I can't do this." He repeated these words over and over while using his feet to push against the ground, as if trying to escape from something. The other soldiers had to use belts to restrain his wrists and ankles to prevent him from running off. It also seemed that the soldier was hallucinating and remained fearful of his comrades who were trying to help him. Upon seeing that the situation was getting worse, Sergeant Luke ordered everyone to halt and set up camp at that spot. He then radioed back to the unit to request reinforcements due to an emergency that made it impossible for them to continue their journey. In the midst of the mysterious jungle, after sending out the distress call, all the soldiers waited hopefully for help from their unit. However, it seemed that fate had a twist for them, as a sudden heavy storm struck, delaying the arrival of the reinforcements even further. As a result, the 8 soldiers and 1 mentally unstable individual were stuck in the jungle longer than anticipated. To make matters worse, the area where they had set up camp was actually a waterway flowing from the nearby mountains and passing right through their campsite. Realizing that staying there could result in being caught in a flash flood, the soldiers decided to carry their mentally unstable comrade and venture deeper into the jungle in hopes of escaping the potential flood path. As they trudged through the jungle, the deranged soldier began to yell and chant incessantly while being carried by his comrades. Despite his apparent madness, the chants that came from his mouth were flawless, with not a single mistake in the recitation. By the time they reached 3 a.m., the floodwaters began to encroach upon their new location, forcing them to move once more. The soldiers were not only wary of the floodwaters and wild animals, but also of the illegal labor traffickers in the area. Sergeant Luke decided to consult with the remaining soldiers. He expressed concern that staying together as a large group could be dangerous, especially since the deranged soldiers' loud outbursts might alert the illegal labor traffickers. They agreed to split into 2 teams. The first team, consisting of 5 soldiers, would move ahead to the rendezvous point. Sergeant Luke instructed them to strictly follow their compass and stay on the designated path. Once they reached the destination, they were to send a signal back. The second team, consisting of Sergeant Luke, 2 other soldiers, and the deranged soldier, would remain at their current location. Their task was to monitor the situation and await the incoming reinforcements. After finalizing the rendezvous point, the 2 teams separated to carry out their respective missions. After some time, the deranged soldier's behavior began to change. Initially, he had been screaming and shouting, but now he seemed to make sense when spoken to. Despite this, he attempted to harm himself and repeatedly muttered, "It's time. They're coming to take my life. I must die," over and over throughout the night. To Sergeant Luke's surprise, he noticed that the two soldiers watching over their distressed comrade began to exhibit strange behavior. They seemed dazed, responding minimally when spoken to, and often not turning when called. The atmosphere around Sergeant Luke became noticeably different as an eerie silence took over, making it feel as if he were sitting there all alone. Considering the elapsed time, the first team should have signaled back as agreed. However, everything remained eerily quiet, causing Sergeant Luke to worry that something might have gone wrong with the advance team. As Sergeant Luke was worrying, the deranged soldier and the two who were watching over him began to speak to each other. What sent chills down his spine was that they were not speaking Thai. From what Sergeant Luke could make out, it seemed to be the language of the local tribe living in the forest. In that moment, Sergeant Luke realized that the three people with him were not his familiar comrades. Confounded and unsure of what to do, Sergeant Luke decided to clasp his hands in a prayer gesture and said, "I am here for work. Can I please get through this situation safely?" He had no idea who he was addressing, but he hoped that the situation would improve, even if only slightly. Just after he finished praying, the deranged soldier began to convulse and bite his tongue. Sergeant Luke frantically searched for something to prevent the soldier from harming himself further. The only thing he could find was the soldier's scarf, and placed it in the soldier's mouth. However, the soldier's condition did not improve despite these efforts. Not long after, the soldier suddenly went still. Sergeant Luke moved closer to check if he was still breathing. Though the soldier was alive, his breathing was extremely shallow. In a faint voice, the soldier said, "Go back, Sergeant. You can't go on. Let me be the only casualty. Don't push forward." He then lost consciousness. Amidst the recent chaos, the remaining two soldiers also started to exhibit strange behaviors. One stood up and began wandering around under the trees, sometimes even climbing them. The other started moving on all fours, resembling an animal. This bizarre situation led Sergeant Luke to clutch his head in frustration and exclaim, "What on earth is happening?" With the situation being so dire, retreating was not an option, nor was continuing forward. Abandoning his comrades was also out of the question. Sergeant Luke had no choice but to endure the troubling circumstances as they unfolded. By around 4 a.m., nearing dawn, the two soldiers behaving like animals began to wander away from their location. Sergeant Luke, fearing they might be dangerous, didn't dare to stop them. Instead, he hid the unconscious soldier under a large tree and cautiously followed the two into the forest, maintaining a safe distance. Sergeant Luke recognized the path they were taking. It led back to the area where the floodwaters had previously surged and where they had first set up camp. However, the two soldiers didn't walk normally. One was leaping while the other ran on all fours like an animal. Sergeant Luke followed them until around 6 a.m. when he saw the two soldiers stop at the spot where offerings had been placed initially. To his shock, the two soldiers suddenly bent down and started ravenously devouring the boiled chicken that had been offered. Horrified, Sergeant Luke shouted, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Unexpectedly, the voices that answered were those of elderly women speaking the local tribal language. They said, "Don't interfere with us. We warned you. You brought this upon yourselves." The soldiers then turned to glare at Sergeant Luke with menacing eyes. In that moment, Sergeant Luke steeled himself and defiantly said, "It's almost morning. If you really are ghosts, you won't be able to withstand the sunlight." However, there was no response. Sergeant Luke could only stand and watch the horrifying scene before him, resembling vultures feasting on a carcass. After some time, the two soldiers exhibiting strange behavior collapsed to the ground. Seeing this, Sergeant Luke quickly rushed to their aid. Soon, both soldiers awoke in a state of shock, gathered their wits, and began recounting their experiences to Sergeant Luke. They explained that the previous night, while keeping watch over the deranged soldier, they had felt drowsy and looked for a spot to rest. They fell asleep and dreamt of a man and a woman inviting them to eat, warning, "Leave this place immediately. If you persist, we'll come for you tonight." Sergeant Luke responded firmly, stating they couldn't leave, considering the unconscious soldier and the 5 other soldiers who had gone ahead. They couldn't abandon anyone in the jungle. After taking some time to regroup, they decided to return to the spot where they had left the unconscious soldier under the tree. To their dismay, the soldier was gone, leaving only footprints leading further into the forest. Following the tracks, they eventually found the deranged soldier washing his face at a stream, looking perfectly normal as if nothing strange had ever happened. When they approached him, he recounted that upon waking, he found himself alone and encountered an elderly man dressed in a sarong and white shirt. The old man told him, "You cannot enter the forest today. The forest is closed. You simply cannot enter." Due to the fact that 5 soldiers who had gone in the night before still showed no signs of coming back, the team decided they needed to go in and search for their missing comrades. They began to track the footprints and proceeded into the forest to find their friends. By the afternoon of the next day, when Sergeant Luke and his group reached the rendezvous point, they found no trace of anyone. To their surprise, the footprints of the soldiers veered off the path to the left from the rendezvous point. At that moment, Sergeant Luke wondered if the 5 soldiers had been taken hostage. He debated whether to follow the footprints further or wait for another reinforcement team. However, waiting could cause delays, so Sergeant Luke and his group decided to follow the footprints into the forest. They continued following the tracks until 4 p.m. At that point, they reached a border area filled with traces of explosives and traps, requiring careful and slow navigation. Sergeant Luke then noticed that the footprints had changed from a line formation to a single file, different from the initial side-by-side formation. This increased his suspicion that the 5 soldiers might indeed have been captured. When they reached the border, Sergeant Luke and his group could go no further, and the footprints of their comrades had completely vanished. As dusk approached and night began to fall, they decided to set up camp and assess the situation, pondering their next move. Sergeant Luke radioed for reinforcements, though he expected they might not arrive soon and were likely on their way to search for them. That night, around 11 p.m., they suddenly heard the voices of the missing 5 soldiers approaching their camp. Everyone was shocked. How had the 5 returned when they had followed their footprints all day without any sign of them, and the tracks had disappeared? Due to the darkness and uncertainty about whether these people were indeed their missing comrades, Sergeant Luke called out a secret code that only their unit would know. The 5 soldiers correctly responded to the code, and with that confirmation, Sergeant Luke rushed to embrace his friends in relief. He immediately asked where they had been, but none of the 5 soldiers replied. Curiously, they appeared to be wet, despite no recent rain. Sergeant Luke inquired if they had fallen into water, but again they did not answer, only stating that they were cold. The five then went about their personal tasks and set up their tents without further conversation, leaving Sergeant Luke and his group puzzled and concerned. After everyone had completed their personal tasks and gone to bed, Sergeant Luke, still wary from the day's events, decided to take the night watch himself. Around 1 a.m., he dozed off due to exhaustion. He was abruptly awakened by the startled cries of the soldier who had initially lost his sanity. Sergeant Luke quickly got up and scanned the area, focusing on the spot where the five soldiers had set up their tents. To his shock, the tents he had seen earlier were now replaced by temporary shelters made from banana leaves, all of which were soaked with water, despite no rain having fallen. Even more disturbingly, the five soldiers were nowhere to be seen. The strange situation left Sergeant Luke and his remaining companions in shock. No one dared to sleep, so they gathered around the campfire, discussing the bizarre events that had occurred. They sat there until dawn, continuously glancing at the five makeshift shelters made from wet banana leaves, astonished and bewildered. At sunrise, they noticed new footprints, but these tracks appeared to lead back the way they had come, towards the stream where they had found the deranged soldier the previous day. Deciding to follow the new tracks, they set off, only to have the once deranged soldier ask to stop for a moment to pee, promising to catch up soon. Sergeant Luke and the others continued ahead. When they reached the stream, they were horrified to find the body of the soldier who had asked to pee, lying face down in the water. Sergeant Luke and two other soldiers quickly ran to check if it was truly their comrade. After verifying the identification tags and nameplate, they confirmed it was indeed the same soldier who had lost his sanity the day before. Confusion filled Sergeant Luke's mind as he processed the situation. After a moment to gather themselves, they decided to make a stretcher to carry their fallen comrade back to camp, planning to wait for the reinforcement team to help with the task. The three soldiers retraced their steps for about 5 kilometers before finally meeting the reinforcement team of 9 soldiers. After exchanging information about the situation, Sergeant Luke ordered the 2 soldiers who had been with him to return to camp and report to their superiors, while he decided to join the reinforcement team to continue searching for the remaining 5 soldiers. This time, the same hunter who had warned them on the first day accompanied them. Before they set off, the hunter spoke to Sergeant Luke, saying, "I told you that the forest was closed that day. Think about it. When we couldn't plant the incense sticks, it meant we weren't allowed to enter the forest. If I had gone in, who knows what dangers we might have faced. I didn't want to lead everyone to their deaths." Sergeant Luke also learned that on the day the hunter left them in the forest, he did not return home. Instead, he headed to the military camp where Sergeant Luke was stationed to report the events to another unit and was the one who led the reinforcements to help them. The group resumed their search for the 5 missing soldiers, heading towards the initial rendezvous point. Coincidentally, this spot happened to be the site of a shrine deep in the forest. Hunters who entered the forest to hunt would often offer sacrifices at this shrine before proceeding. The guide, the hunter who accompanied them, found it curious that Sergeant Luke had chosen this specific spot, out of many possible locations, as the rendezvous point. Sergeant Luke himself had no explanation for his choice. As they moved deeper into the forest and reached the shrine, the hunter instructed everyone to stop. He then approached the shrine to pay respects. While he was praying, a strong gust of wind suddenly blew through, and the sky darkened as if a storm was imminent. Unexpectedly, the hunter collapsed to the ground and then shifted into a seated position, raising one knee. He took out a cigarette and began to smoke, then spoke in a different tone, saying, "Your friends are not dead. It is not yet their time, but I am not letting them out. It is not yet time for them to come out." At that moment, the leader of the reinforcement team asked the hunter what they needed to do to rescue the remaining soldiers. The hunter, in a solemn tone, replied, "At midnight, bring offerings to appease me, and I will guide you." They discussed among themselves, realizing that the specific offerings mentioned by the hunter would be impossible to gather in time, given the distance and the limited time available. The leader of the reinforcement team and Sergeant Luke pleaded, promising to bring the offerings within 7 days if the 5 soldiers could be safely returned. This seemed to have an effect, as it appeared that whatever spirit or entity had possessed the hunter left his body. They set up camp at the location, waiting until midnight. At that time, the hunter began a ritual to enter a trance again, lighting 18 incense sticks. He instructed the soldiers, "See the incense in my hand? If we don't find them by the time the incense burns out, then stop looking. They won't be returned. But if we are fortunate, we will find them before the incense burns out." The hunter lit the incense and led the soldiers deeper into the forest. They followed, searching for the missing men as the incense gradually burned down. When the incense sticks were half burned, they still hadn't found any sign of the soldiers. Sergeant Luke noted that the forest was filled with a foul, putrid smell, though he couldn't determine its source. The pervasive stench made them fear that it might be the smell of their comrades' decomposing bodies. Despite their fears, they pressed on, determined to find their missing friends before it was too late. The hunter led them deeper into the forest, holding the incense sticks. Suddenly, Sergeant Luke noticed the Thai flag planted in the area they had first entered. This time, he saw a large archway resembling that of an abandoned temple. They decided to investigate the area and, finally, found the 5 missing soldiers. The soldiers were gaunt and exhausted. They explained to Sergeant Luke that they had been unable to leave the area. At night, they heard footsteps, animal noises, and eerie screams around the vicinity. They also recounted how, after they had split off, they encountered an elderly man dressed in a sarong and white shirt who promised to lead them back to their group. The elderly man led them to the abandoned temple, instructing them to wait there while he fetched the rest of their team. After leading them to the temple, the old hunter disappeared into the darkness. During that event, they successfully rescued the 5 remaining soldiers from the forest safely. The family of the soldier who had died accepted the circumstances without contention, as the autopsy revealed he had died from sudden cardiac arrest of unknown cause. Later, Sergeant Luke, along with the same hunter, ventured back into the forest to fulfill the vow they had made. Sergeant Luke and over 10 soldiers brought numerous offerings. During the ritual, they discovered that the spirit possessing the hunter was not the same one from the initial incident. Instead, it was the spirit of the deceased soldier. He communicated with everyone present, explaining that the entire incident, including why the 5 soldiers had to hide in the abandoned temple, was due to a clash between minority rebellion groups and the authorities of a neighboring country on the night it all happened. If the 5 soldiers had not changed their route, there would have been a conflict, resulting in more casualties. He asked them to make merit for him, stating that he had fulfilled his duty to the best of his ability. After delivering this message, the soldier's spirit left the hunter's body. This incident caused Sergeant Luke to reflect on the day everything happened. He realized that if he had heeded the hunter's warning from the beginning, the tragic loss might have been avoided.